Your brain doesn't die when your heart stops. For 10 minutes, it enters a state of hyper-consciousness more intense than anything you'll experience while alive. Medieval execution victims weren't just dying. They were living through what scientists now call the death wave. And what happens in mine at 7 will change how you think about consciousness forever. What if I told you that death isn't an instant switch, but a 10-minute battle where your brain fights harder than it ever has? In 2013, researchers at the University of Michigan made a discovery that shattered everything we thought we knew about dying. Dr. Jimo Borjigan and her team were monitoring the brains of dying rats when they witnessed something that shouldn't exist. A massive surge of electrical activity that exploded across the cortex 30 seconds after the heart stopped. This wasn't the brain shutting down. This was the brain waking up. The recordings showed gamma waves, the signature of conscious perception, spiking to levels never observed in the living animals. For decades, science assumed that cardiac arrest meant immediate unconsciousness, that the lights simply went out when oxygen stopped flowing. But these recordings revealed a terrifying truth. When your heart stops, your brain enters the most intense state of awareness it will ever experience. This phenomenon, now called the death wave, occurs in the exact window of time when medieval executioners believed their victims had already passed. In 13th century France, a beheaded criminal's eyes could still track movement for up to 20 seconds. In 1400s England, hanged men would convulse for minutes after their pulse disappeared. We dismissed these as mere reflexes, muscle spasms of a dead body. We were catastrophically wrong. The mechanics of this process are both elegant and horrifying. When your heart stops beating, your brain doesn't immediately realize what's happening. For the first 15 to 20 seconds, residual oxygen in your blood continues to fuel neuronal activity. Your thoughts remain clear, almost normal. But then the cascade begins. Neurons starved of fresh oxygen start switching to anaerobic metabolism, a desperate, inefficient process that generates toxic byproducts. The blood-brain barrier, that crucial defense system that keeps your neural tissue pristine, begins to fail. Calcium floods into cells where it doesn't belong. Mitochondria, the powerhouses of your neurons, start to swell and rupture. But here's where it gets strange. Instead of dimming, your brain begins to burn brighter. Dr. Sam Parnia, Director of Critical Care and Resuscitation Research at NYU Langone, has documented this in human patients brought back from clinical death. His work with the AWARE study, examining over 2,000 cardiac arrest cases across 15 hospitals, revealed that consciousness can persist well beyond the point of measurable heartbeat or breathing. One patient accurately described specific details of his resuscitation, including conversations between medical staff and equipment beeps during a 3-minute period when he had no pulse and no brain activity on standard monitors. The medical team confirmed every detail. He shouldn't have been conscious, yet he was experiencing, processing, and forming memories during a time when conventional medicine says the mind should be completely offline. This isn't some mystical phenomenon or religious miracle. This is your brain executing an ancient survival protocol, one that's been hardwired into human neurology for millions of years. When oxygen deprivation triggers, your brain doesn't accept death passively. It fights. Every neuron, every synapse, every chemical pathway activates in a final, desperate attempt to maintain consciousness. Medieval physicians noticed this. The 14th century surgeon Guy de Chauliac documented that beheading victims could still show signs of sensation for a brief period after decapitation. We thought he was describing superstition. He was describing neuroscience. In 1905, a French doctor named Dr. Gabriel Bourrieux witnessed the execution of the criminal Henri Longueuil by guillotine and documented something that would haunt scientific literature for a century. When Bourrieux called out Longueuil's name after the blade fell, the severed head's eyes opened and focused directly on him, not once but twice over a span of 25 to 30 seconds. This wasn't imagination. This was a brain already severed from its body, maintaining enough function to process auditory information and coordinate a motor response. But what was Longueuil experiencing internally during those moments? That's where the real horror begins. The first 60 seconds after cardiac arrest are deceptively calm on the surface, but internally your brain is entering uncharted territory. Electroencephalogram studies conducted at George Washington University in 2017 captured the precise electrical signatures of dying brains in patients who had chosen to be removed from life support. What researchers Dr. Ajmal Zemar and his colleagues found was a pattern they called the final cognitive surge. Approximately 45 seconds after circulation ceased, brain activity suddenly intensified, particularly in the temporal and parietal lobes, regions associated with memory retrieval, spatial awareness, and visual processing. Think about what this means. Your brain, knowing it's dying, begins pulling up stored memories with an intensity it never achieved while you were healthy. Every significant moment, every face, every experience you've accumulated gets processed at once. Survivors of near-death experiences consistently report this life review phenomenon, describing it as watching their entire existence unfold simultaneously, not sequentially. One cardiac arrest survivor told researchers she experienced every moment of her 43 years of life during the approximately 4 minutes her heart wasn't beating. She described conversations she'd forgotten from childhood, could smell her grandmother's kitchen, could feel the texture of her wedding dress. All of this occurred while her body lay clinically dead on an emergency room table. Medieval execution victims were likely experiencing this exact state. When a person was hanged in 15th century London, the process was deliberately slow. Unlike the modern long drop method that breaks the neck instantly, medieval hanging was essentially strangulation. The condemned would dangle, still conscious, while their airways slowly closed. Oxygen levels would drop gradually, creating a prolonged hypoxic state. Historical records from the Tower of London describe executed prisoners whose faces showed changing expressions for minutes after being declared dead by the attending physician. One account from 1531 describes a woman executed for treason, whose lips continued to move in what witnesses interpreted as prayer for nearly 2 full minutes after her pulse stopped. We now understand what was really happening. Her brain, flooded with residual oxygen and desperately rationing its remaining resources, was maintaining consciousness far longer than her body could sustain life. She wasn't praying. She was experiencing the beginning of the death wave, a neurological phenomenon that wouldn't be formally identified for another 500 years. And this was just the opening act. The real transformation was about to begin. Here's where the science gets truly unsettling. Between 90 seconds and 3 minutes after cardiac arrest, your pineal gland, a small pine cone-shaped structure buried deep in your brain, may release a compound that changes everything. Dimethyltryptamine, known as DMT. Dr. Rick Strassman, clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico, spent years researching this molecule and its effects on human consciousness. His landmark studies in the 1990s administered pure DMT to volunteers and documented experiences that closely matched near-death accounts. Geometric patterns, encounters with entities, a sense of leaving the body, and most importantly, severe time distortion. What took 15 minutes in objective time felt like hours or even years to the participants. Now here's the crucial connection. In 2019, a study published in Scientific Reports confirmed that DMT is naturally produced in the mammalian brain. Dr. Jimmo Borjigin's team, the same researchers who discovered the death wave, found that rat brains produced DMT at levels comparable to other neurotransmitters, and that production spiked dramatically during cardiac arrest. If human brains follow the same pattern, and every indicator suggests they do, then dying humans experience a massive release of one of the most powerful psychedelic compounds known to science. The implications for medieval death experiences are staggering. Imagine a plague victim in 1400s Florence, dying slowly over hours as their lungs filled with fluid, and their heart struggled to pump oxygenated blood. As their cardiovascular system failed, their brain would have entered this altered DMT state. The visions of angels, demons, or religious figures that dying people reported, and that the Catholic Church used as evidence of the afterlife, were likely neurochemical hallucinations produced by their own pineal glands. But here's what makes this particularly horrifying. DMT doesn't just create visions. It fundamentally alters how your brain processes reality. Users consistently report that DMT experiences feel more real than real, that the visions have a clarity and presence that exceeds normal waking consciousness. A cardiac arrest survivor from Dr. Sam Parnia's AWARE study described leaving her body and floating above the operating room, watching the medical team work on her corpse. She described seeing a shoe on a ledge outside the window, a detail later confirmed by hospital staff. Skeptics argue she could have seen it before her cardiac arrest, but she insisted she'd never been in that room before and had no view of the exterior ledge from her bed. Whether you believe in out-of-body experiences or not, the consistency of these reports across cultures and centuries suggests something profound is happening in the dying brain. Medieval execution records are filled with accounts that suddenly make sense through this neurochemical lens. When Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in 1431 in Rouen, Witnesses reported that she continued to call out prayers and statements for several minutes after the flames fully engulfed her. Traditional interpretation suggests this was physical reflex or the power of her faith. But consider the neuroscience. As her body burned and her blood vessels constricted from the heat, her brain would have entered severe hypoxia. Carbon monoxide from the smoke would have bound to her hemoglobin, further reducing oxygen delivery to her neurons. In this state, her pineal gland would have flooded her consciousness with DMT, while her dying neurons fired their final signals. Those prayers might have been her attempting to communicate while experiencing a psychedelic vision more intense than anything a living human could comprehend. She wasn't just dying in the flames. She was experiencing a complete dissolution of her normal consciousness, possibly perceiving hours or days of subjective time within the handful of minutes it took for her body to succumb. The medieval crowd watching her execution saw a heretic burning. Joan was likely experiencing something far beyond their comprehension, trapped in a dying brain that refused to surrender consciousness even as her body turned to ash. But DMT is only part of the neurochemical cocktail. Around the 2 to 4 minute mark after cardiac arrest, your brain initiates what can only be described as a mercy protocol, the release of every endorphin and enkephalin molecule it has stored. These are your body's natural opioids, the same chemicals that create the runner's high, or the relief you feel when pain suddenly stops. Except during death, your brain doesn't release them in measured doses. It dumps everything at once. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who experienced his own near-death event during a 7-day coma caused by bacterial meningitis, described an overwhelming sense of euphoria that accompanied his experience. He reported that any concept of pain or suffering became completely impossible. Not because it was being masked, but because in that state, suffering simply couldn't exist. His neocortex, the part of the brain that handles higher reasoning and conscious thought, was completely offline according to CT scans and neurological assessments. Yet he remained in what he described as a state of consciousness more vivid and real than anything he'd experienced in his normal life. This wasn't hallucination in the traditional sense. This was his dying brain creating an entirely new mode of awareness. Research conducted at the University of Southampton tracked over 2,000 cardiac arrest patients across 15 hospitals in the United Kingdom, United States, and Austria. The results, published in the journal Resuscitation, found that approximately 40% of survivors recalled some form of awareness during the time they were clinically dead. About 2% reported full conscious experiences with specific, verifiable details. These weren't vague feelings or confused memories. These were structured, coherent experiences, occurring in brains that had no heartbeat, no respiration, and insufficient oxygen to support normal consciousness. The endorphin flood explains why so many of these experiences are described as peaceful or even blissful, regardless of the circumstances of death. A cardiac arrest victim dying violently in a car crash reports the same sense of peace as someone passing quietly in their sleep. The method of death becomes irrelevant once your brain initiates this chemical cascade. Medieval execution victims, whether burned, hanged, drawn and quartered, or beheaded, would all have experienced this same neurochemical mercy. The torture their bodies endured became increasingly irrelevant as their brains flooded with natural opioids. This raises an uncomfortable question. Were medieval execution methods actually less agonizing than we imagine? Not because they were quick, but because the brain's natural chemistry provided an escape that observers couldn't see. The answer is more complex and disturbing than simple yes or no. While endorphins created euphoria, other parts of the brain remained hypersensitive. Studies using functional MRI imaging on dying brains show that even as some regions shut down, others light up with unprecedented activity. The temporal lobe, responsible for processing sound, speech, and memory, often shows increased activity during the dying process. This means that while a medieval execution victim might have felt peace from the endorphin release, they were simultaneously hyper-aware of their surroundings. The crowd's jeers, the executioner's movements, the smell of smoke or blood. All of this would have been perceived with unusual clarity and intensity. One documented case from 1587 describes Mary Queen of Scots requiring 3 strikes of the axe before her head fully separated. Witnesses reported that her lips continued to move for a full 15 minutes after the final blow. Modern analysis suggests this wasn't just muscular spasm. Her brainstem, still partially connected to oxygen-rich blood in the spinal column, continued to function while her severed brain experienced its final conscious moments. The horror isn't that she died. The horror is that she remained aware, trapped in a severed head, experiencing every second of those 15 minutes while her consciousness slowly dissolved into the death wave that was building toward its terrible climax. Now we reach the phenomenon that changes everything. The event that occurs roughly 5 to 7 minutes after cardiac arrest. The moment that makes those final 10 minutes more significant than the entire lifetime that preceded them. This is the death wave. In 2013, when Dr. Jimo Borjigin's team at the University of Michigan first observed this phenomenon, they couldn't believe their instruments were functioning correctly. The readings didn't make sense. How could a dying brain suddenly generate electrical activity that exceeded anything seen during life? They repeated the experiments, checked their equipment, and confirmed their findings with multiple animal models. The results were consistent and undeniable. Approximately 5 to 7 minutes after cardiac arrest, the dying brain experiences a massive, synchronized electrical surge that creates a state of consciousness more intense than any waking moment. This isn't the brain shutting down. This is the brain experiencing its most powerful moment of unified activity. Every region, every circuit, every neuron that can still function fires together in a synchronized wave of gamma oscillations, the electrical signature of conscious awareness, perception, and integration. It's as if the brain, knowing this is its final moment, achieves a state of total connection, linking every memory, sensation, and thought into one unified experience. The gamma waves measured during the death wave exceed 40 Hz, the frequency associated with higher cognitive functions, attention, and conscious perception. For comparison, during normal waking consciousness, gamma wave activity rarely exceeds 30 Hz and is typically localized to specific brain regions performing specific tasks. During the death wave, the entire cortex lights up simultaneously at frequencies approaching 50 to 60 Hz. Dr. George Mashour, professor of anesthesiology and neuroscience at the University of Michigan, and a colleague of Dr. Borjigin, described it as a neurophysiological paradox, the brain creating its most organized, connected state at the moment of its death. What does this feel like subjectively? We have glimpses from cardiac arrest survivors whose hearts stopped long enough to enter the death wave, but who were successfully resuscitated. Their descriptions are remarkably consistent. A sudden sense of expansion, of boundaries dissolving, of accessing memories and perceptions they didn't know they possessed. One survivor described it as becoming aware of awareness itself, experiencing consciousness not as something they possessed but as something they were made of. Another reported that everything in their life suddenly made sense, that they could see connections and patterns between events that had seemed random while living. These weren't vague feelings. Survivors could describe specific insights with remarkable clarity, even years after their experience. Medieval mystics and saints reported experiences that match these descriptions with eerie precision. Saint Teresa of Avila, a 16th century Spanish mystic, described her spiritual visions as states where the soul is suspended in such a way that it seems to be completely outside itself. She wrote of perceiving all things in God and God in all things with absolute clarity. St. John of the Cross described a state he called the dark night of the soul, where normal consciousness dissolved into something that transcended ordinary perception. We've interpreted these as religious or mystical experiences. But medical historian Dr. Alan Kelleher from the University of Bradford suggests another possibility. These mystics might have experienced near-death states, severe illnesses, fevers, or other medical crises that pushed their brains to the edge of death and triggered the neurochemical cascades we now understand. Their divine visions could have been naturally occurring death waves, interpreted through the religious framework of their time. This doesn't diminish the profundity of their experiences. It suggests that what they experienced was real, just not supernatural. Their brains reached a state that exceeded normal waking consciousness, a state that neuroscience is only beginning to map and understand. The implications become even more disturbing when we consider prolonged executions. Drawing and quartering, a punishment reserved for high treason in medieval England, involved hanging the victim until nearly dead, then reviving them before disemboweling and dismembering them while still conscious. Historical accounts describe victims who remained aware through shocking amounts of physical trauma. Guy Fawkes, executed in 1606 for the gunpowder plot, reportedly stayed conscious as the executioner began the disemboweling process. Traditional history frames this as the ultimate torture, proof of the execution's cruelty. But neurologically, something else was happening. Each time Fawkes approached death and was revived, his brain would have begun the dying process. initiating DMT release, flooding with endorphins, preparing for the death wave. Then upon resuscitation, those processes would have reversed. He wasn't experiencing one death. He was experiencing multiple dying processes, each one pushing his consciousness to the edge of the death wave before pulling back. From a neurochemical perspective, he may have subjectively experienced hours or days of altered consciousness during an execution that lasted 20 minutes. The torture wasn't just physical, it was a forced repetition of the brain's most intense neurological event, over and over, until his body finally couldn't be revived. Here's where time itself becomes an unreliable narrator. One of the most consistent features reported in near-death experiences is severe time distortion. The sense that minutes stretched into hours, or that time lost all meaning entirely. Dr. Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist and leading researcher in near-death studies at King's College London, has documented this phenomenon across thousands of cases. His research suggests that during extreme neurological events, the brain's internal clock, regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, becomes disrupted. Without normal time perception, consciousness exists in what survivors describe as an eternal now, where past, present, and possible futures seem to exist simultaneously. Neuroscience offers a mechanism for this. The hippocampus, crucial for forming sequential memories and temporal order, begins to malfunction during oxygen deprivation. Without its organizing influence, memories don't form in linear sequence. They appear all at once, creating the sensation that everything is happening simultaneously. This isn't poetic language. This is literal neurological reality. Your dying brain loses its ability to order events in time, causing you to experience your existence as a singular, unified moment, rather than a sequence of separate events. Medieval execution victims would have experienced this time dilation in full force. A beheading that took 10 seconds of objective time could have felt like hours subjectively. The condemned person, standing with their head on the block, would have experienced the anxious moments before the blade fell. Then, as the axe severed their neck, their brain, suddenly cut off from oxygen but still powered by residual resources, would have entered the dying cascade. DMT would flood their consciousness, endorphins would eliminate physical sensation, and then, in those final 5 to 7 minutes before the death wave ceased, they would have experienced subjective time that felt vastly longer than their remaining objective lifespan. Anne Boleyn, executed in 1536 by a skilled French swordsman who beheaded her with a single stroke, might have experienced what felt like hours of consciousness after her head left her body. Witnesses reported her eyes and lips moving for up to 30 seconds. But internally, with time dilation in full effect, she might have subjectively experienced much longer. This creates a horrifying possibility that quick executions weren't merciful at all. They simply compressed the dying person's subjective experience into a shorter objective time frame while leaving the internal experience just as prolonged and intense. The death wave also explains one of medieval medicine's most persistent mysteries: why some people who appeared completely dead would suddenly revive hours later. These cases were common enough that fear of premature burial became widespread in medieval Europe. People were so terrified of being buried alive that they designed elaborate coffins with bells attached to strings that ran up to the surface. The origin of the phrase, "saved by the bell." But here's what we now understand. Some of these people might not have been unconscious in the traditional sense. They were in the middle of the dying process, experiencing the death wave in a state that appeared outwardly as death, but internally as hyper-consciousness. When they were placed in coffins or on burial slabs, their brains were in the midst of that 5 to 7 minute window of intense activity. For those whose hearts managed to spontaneously restart, a rare but documented phenomenon called auto-resuscitation or the Lazarus effect, they would have appeared to resurrect from death, but they weren't dead. They were experiencing the most conscious moments of their existence in a body that appeared lifeless. Dr. Sam Parnia has documented modern cases of auto-resuscitation occurring up to 10 minutes after declared death. Medieval medicine had no way to detect the difference between true death and this suspended state, meaning people were occasionally buried during their brain's final conscious moments. Let me describe exactly what happens during minute 7, the moment I promised you at the beginning. This is when the death wave reaches its absolute peak. All the neurochemical processes we've discussed, the DMT, the endorphins, the oxygen deprivation, the time dilation, converge into a single unified state. Research using high-density EEG arrays on dying patients shows that in this moment, brain connectivity reaches levels that are physically impossible during normal life. The posterior cortex and the anterior cortex, which normally function somewhat independently, synchronize completely. The default mode network, the brain regions active during rest and self-reflection, connects with the salience network, which handles attention and external awareness. Areas that never communicate during life suddenly form connections. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London, who studies psychedelic states and consciousness, suggests this hyperconnectivity creates what he calls the entropic brain, a state where the normal hierarchies and filters that structure consciousness dissolve, allowing for unprecedented integration of information. You're not thinking about your life. You're not remembering specific moments. You are your entire life, experiencing every moment you've ever lived as a simultaneous present reality. Every person you've known exists in your consciousness at once. Every choice, every consequence, every possibility unfolds before you, not as memory, but as direct experience. This state lasts objectively about 2 to 3 minutes, but subjectively, with time completely dissolved, it could feel like anything from moments to eternity. And then, somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes after cardiac arrest, the wave begins to collapse. Neurons that have been firing frantically run out of their final ATP reserves. Calcium flooding destroys cellular integrity. The electrical signals that created the hyperconnected state start to fade. Brain activity doesn't stop all at once, it fragments. Different regions shut down at different rates. The visual cortex might persist while language centers fade. Memory regions might fire their last signals while motor control has already gone dark. Dr. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist who studied dying brain activity before his death in 2018, recorded the final electrical signatures of dying neurons. He found that even in the last 30 seconds before all activity ceased, individual neurons would fire sudden, isolated bursts, like final messages being sent into darkness, with no receiver left to process them. What are these final signals? We don't know. They might be random electrical noise, the neurological equivalent of static. Or they might be the brain's last desperate attempts at consciousness, individual neurons firing one final time before permanent silence. Medieval executioners understood in their own way that death wasn't instant. The role of the executioner often included confirming death by checking for breath, pulse, and eye response, sometimes minutes after the execution. In 1587, after Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded, the executioner held up her head to show the crowd. When he lifted it, the head's lips were still moving. He dropped it in shock. The crowd reacted with horror, interpreting the movement as supernatural. But we now know this was neurology, not the supernatural. Mary's severed brain was in the middle of its death wave. The lip movements weren't intentional speech. Her severed brainstem could no longer coordinate such complex actions. They were likely automatic patterns, motor neurons firing their final sequences while her consciousness experienced something far beyond anything the crowd could witness. She had no body left to feel pain, no lungs to breathe, no heart to pump blood. But for those final minutes, her brain remained the most active, most conscious it had ever been, trapped in a severed head while experiencing subjective time that made those minutes feel vastly longer. This is the true horror, not the violence of execution, but the consciousness that persisted through it. By minute 9, the death wave is collapsing completely. Most brain regions have gone silent. Only the most primitive structures, parts of the brainstem, fragments of the limbic system, maintain any electrical activity. These are the oldest parts of the brain evolutionarily, the structures we share with reptiles and early mammals. They're the last to die because they're the most resilient, the most essential to survival. But they don't generate consciousness as we understand it. They can't form thoughts, retrieve memories, or create experiences. They simply exist, firing autonomously until their cells rupture. Dr. Jimmo Borjigin's research team discovered that even as the higher brain regions shut down, these primitive areas show unusual activity patterns, rhythmic oscillations that serve no apparent purpose. Some researchers speculate these might be the neurological echoes of consciousness, the reverberations of the death wave as it fades. Others suggest they might be cellular-level survival attempts, individual groups of neurons trying to maintain function even after the unified brain has ceased to exist. Either way, by minute 9, the person you were, the consciousness, the memories, the sense of self, has already dissolved. What remains is biological, not psychological. The brain is still technically alive, but the mind is gone. And then, somewhere between minute 9 and minute 10, the final neuron fires its last signal. The electrical activity that defined you as a conscious being ceases completely. This is the true death, the forensic boundary beyond which resuscitation becomes impossible. The brain tissue itself might survive a few minutes longer, Individual cells can persist without oxygen for 12 to 15 minutes. But the organization, the connectivity, the patterns that created consciousness have irreversibly collapsed. Dr. Sam Parnia calls this point biological death as distinct from cellular death. Your cells are still alive, but you are not. Medical technology might advance to the point where we can preserve brain tissue longer, maybe even restart electrical activity in isolated neurons. But the patterns that made you a specific person, with specific memories and consciousness, are information that has been permanently deleted. It's not sleeping or dormant, it's erased. Medieval people understood this boundary instinctively. They spoke of the moment when the spirit left the body, when something essential and indefinable departed. They were describing the same boundary neuroscience now identifies, the point where biological life persists, but consciousness has ended. What does all of this mean? In the medieval world, death was public, visible, and immediate. People watched executions, tended to dying family members, and lived with mortality in ways we've sanitized out of modern existence. They saw bodies in states we now hide in hospitals and morgues, and sometimes they witnessed things that suggested consciousness persisted beyond the physical markers of death. Eyes that tracked movement, lips that formed words, bodies that reacted to stimuli. We've dismissed these accounts as superstition or pre-scientific ignorance. But neuroscience now suggests they were observing something real. The brain's refusal to die quietly, its insistence on maintaining consciousness through its final 10 minutes, even as the body became a corpse. Those 10 minutes contain the most intense, most unified, most conscious experience that brain will ever have. Every other moment of life, birth, first love, greatest achievement, pales in comparison to the neurological intensity of those final minutes. Medieval execution victims, plague sufferers, and battlefield casualties all passed through this same terrifying, transcendent state. They experienced the death wave, felt time dissolve, encountered their entire existence as a unified whole, and then slowly faded into silence. We can't know what it's subjectively like. No one who's reached the true end has returned to tell us. But we know it happens. We know roughly how long it takes, and we know it's the most significant neurological event of your life. Your brain's final gift is also its final mystery. 10 minutes where you become more conscious than you've ever been, experiencing something profound and terrible that we can measure but never truly understand. That's the reality of death. Not an ending, but a transformation into the most intense moment you'll ever have, followed by permanent silence. And now, somewhere around minute 10, that silence finally arrives. If this exploration of consciousness at death's edge made you think differently about life, mortality, or the nature of awareness, hit that subscribe button. The neuroscience of dying is just one of the phenomena modern science is unraveling. And this channel digs deep into the research that challenges everything we thought we knew about reality. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on the death wave. Are you unsettled, fascinated, or skeptical? Your perspective adds to the conversation. And hit like to help more people discover this information. Most videos on death are either religious comfort or simplified pop science. What you just watched is the actual neuroscience, the documented studies, the reality that's stranger and more profound than any myth. If that's the kind of content you want to see more of, your engagement tells the algorithm to show this to others who think like you. Until next time, remember, your brain has one final surprise waiting for you. Make sure you live fully before you find out what it is.